Chapter 16. My wife, Colin corrected. Since you're surprisingly up to speed for someone who claimed they were too scared to approach the dragons, I assume you know that much. And I'm not just being pedantic. She is mine, and also the ruler of my homeland. I would rather you spoke of her with respect, if at all. Why, of course, and 1,000 apologies. The faint translucence of the shadow executed one of those confusing form shifts that took Colin a moment to recognize. It had swept a deep, elaborate bow toward him. And on that subject, is Amar Alafine's human form as busty as rumor says? I've only seen artistic depictions, mind, but the artists were all pretty emphatic on that point. He knew better than to let it get a rise out of him. So, I gather Amar Alafine is the one you were worried about encountering. Any of the ladies might have sniffed me out. There are no fools or weaklings among them, as you're sure to have begun noticing. She, though. Yeah, the White Wind would definitely have spotted me coming anywhere close to her home. Honestly, even right here is pushing it, but I just couldn't resist. The entity shifted again, bouncing incongruously, and Colin realized after a moment it was clapping its shadowy hands. Here it is. We did it. Your moment of triumph. How could I not give my congratulations in person? Congratulations accepted, Colin said curtly. And let me guess, next you're going to tell me you planned for this whole outcome. Oh, Colin my boy, believe you me I would love to take credit for arranging this. You're positioned so much better for your next steps than I even dared to dream. But no, in all seriousness, this I did not see coming. I figured after you took out Atraximos the rest of them would just back down and let you leave. Instead. Look. Just look at yourself. Colin the Dragon Lair. I actually figured you'd claim to have accounted for all possible outcomes and saw this coming. Life is full of surprises, my young friend. If you ever encounter anything which claims to be omniscient, know that it's trying to intimidate you, and the fact that it feels a need to means it's covering for a weakness. Seriously, Colin, my plans are ambitious, but actually hooking you up with 3 elder dragons was too rich a prospect even for my blood. Now, it goes without saying that those 3 are doing this for their own reasons and using you, but I figure you're sharp enough to recognize that. It doesn't have to be a red flag, either, so long as you know what's up and have your own plans. The most stable relationships are based on mutual self-interest. So far, so reasonable. The creature was more apparently benign than he'd expected. At this point, that fact alone made Colin more suspicious. So, you're a god, then? Oh, am I? The entity sounded positively gleeful, which meant nothing. It usually did. I see you've already been getting some coaching. That's good. Take full advantage of every drop of expertise you can wring out of those dragons. But don't forget to account for your biases, Tell buddy. After the explanations you've been getting all morning, it's understandable you'd have gods on the brain. Did your new harem happen to explain the main reason you should specifically avoid the attention of gods from here on out? Colin leaned back from it, narrowing his eyes. Apparently. Gods are intolerant of potential competition. A sweeping generalization, said the entity, but one worth keeping in mind. Gods are individuals just like anybody. They all have their various agendas and personalities, and quite a few are quite supportive of the young and weak. But, when the odds are at absolute best even, and the worst case is your ass getting scrubbed from existence, it pays to be cautious. Still, one thing I'd be very surprised to see is a god going around elevating new godlings. As a general rule, Colin, anybody with a lot of power is invested in the status quo. Colin stared at the faint discoloration in the air, thinking. That had been a bunch of reasonable advice and perspective, which very adroitly ran circles around his original question until it had created just enough obfuscation that it wasn't obvious how completely it had avoided an answer. This is still how it's going to be, then? He murmured. I'll give you one more chance at a straight answer. Why did you want me to be a godling? But I already answered that, the entity chuckled, Remember? I get what I want by getting you what you want. You went and scored a lot more of what you want than either of us was expecting, but so much the better. We're not at cross purposes here, Colin. You have the power now to rectify certain wrongs in the world, and the motivation to use it. The shadow drifted upward off the ground and spread its arms. Blurry and translucent as it was, that might have been a gesture of benediction, or a shrug. And thus, the world is one step closer to being a little bit better. Gods and dragons and whatever else, that's all any of us can hope to accomplish. To leave this wreck of an existence just a smidge less miserable than we found it. Yeah, I didn't really think so, Colin said with a sigh. It's all conundrums and deflections all the way down. It doesn't feel good to brush off somebody who's done so much for me, but it remains true that you have never been straight with me. I don't know who or what you are, what you want, why you're doing this, or what might happen to me if I follow this all the way to the end. He straightened up and took another step back, bringing himself up against the balustrade. Sorry to say it, but I have new and better sources of help. And you know what makes the difference? They told me what their agenda is. Oh ho oh ho. The entity actually did a sort of pirouette in midair, shaking with mirth. Is that what you thought was happening here? You're betraying one mentor for another. Well, Colin, props for standing up for yourself. Seriously, nothing could make me happier than to see that backbone. But no, sorry, I'm afraid it's too late for that. Colin experienced a spike of adrenaline at the words, despite the entity's deliberately non-threatening posture and tone. It wasn't coming any closer, which they both knew meant nothing. He reached within himself, finding the comforting glow of divine power there, waiting to be unleashed. But it was power tilted to a very specific end, and this was no dragon he was facing. Would it even help? He couldn't help recalling Emir Alafin's warning, no godling is a match for any god. You've already won, the entity said, its voice suddenly almost gentle. This is your victory, Colin. This was all I wanted. You have everything you need, now. I can tell you've decided to be aggressively skeptical of me now that you have other help, but you also know the sound of good sense when you hear it, so here's some more. I recommend you take a break. We've been going non-stop for most of a year, not that there was any choice. But your targets are safe and happy, living high on the hog and unlikely to be snatched from you by a rival before you turn your attention to them. If anything, that just makes it more perfect. Let them savor the ill-gotten gains of their perfidy, never suspecting what's coming their way. It'll make your ultimate retribution all the sweeter. Relax and enjoy what you've won, if only enough to rejuvenate yourself. Enjoy a bit of wealth, and comfort, and what I've gotta assume is impressively athletic sex. You've earned all of that. And when you're ready to finish what you started, why, you're better positioned for it now than I'd even dared to hope. Iziro alone opens any possible avenue you could need to get to anyone in Rivkebet. What with one thing and another, even as he'd had to consciously call back to the lessons he'd gained from the targets of his planned vengeance, Colin had almost forgotten over the last day what had set him on this course in the first place. Astonishing the difference a day made, when that day was spent wrangling fractious dragon spouses and their various centigenarian teenagers, rather than weltering in his pain and grief alone in the wilderness, or having his inscrutable spectral guide provoking him to. Colin had a sudden flash of insight. I am reconsidering my priorities, he stated, choosing his words with great care. Not that Hactria and the Lord Scribe deserve the peace and plenty they're enjoying, but I'm starting to see a prospect of having some of that for myself. Having more of it than they could ever dream. So, maybe, they don't need to be my problem anymore. The entity was quiet. Just floating there, looking at him. No teasing, manipulation, or giddy antics. Just. This was new. After all, Colin continued after a moment, keeping his tone as deliberately casual as he could, they do say that living well is the don't. He shied back, leaning against the balustrade, as the entity surged abruptly toward him. It immediately relented as if catching itself in an error, retreating to give Colin space. When it spoke again, that uncharacteristic urgency was also gone, leaving only its customary insouciant cheerfulness. People also say money can't buy happiness, but only poor people. Have you ever noticed that? You don't read many great literary epics about heroes gaining the ultimate triumph of living well. Oh, the evil king burned down my village, sold my family to pirates, molested my prize goat and turned my ancestral home into a burlesque tax office, but look how well I'm living now. That'll show him. Just not very satisfying, is it? It's just one of those old sayings that gets repeated and promoted because it serves the agenda of those in power not to have people thinking they can retaliate against abuses. It goes to show, just because something is often repeated doesn't necessarily mean it isn't stupid. Colin remained silent, watching it. Despite how quickly the entity had covered, there was no mistaking that he had just seen it angry for the first time. Aside from that unprecedented peek into its true goals and feelings, he was still only mostly sure this was a god he was dealing with, a class of being he had been explicitly warned he could not handle in a confrontation. All that was certain was that it wasn't a dragon, which meant he had no idea what it could do to him if provoked, or how little he could do about it. But hey, there's no reason to argue about it, the entity continued when Colin failed to speak, still upbeat and perky. Not when you can so easily have it both ways. Take your well-earned rest, Colin, and enjoy some of the spoils, that's my advice. And also, tell those new wives of yours something of your life story, just watch how eager they are to pitch in. 'Cause, see, that's one thing about dragons I didn't tell you earlier, because I never imagined you would go and make it so relevant. The only thing dragons love more than treasure is revenge. You told me they wouldn't try to retaliate if I killed their husband. And you have seen how right I was, way more vividly than I expected, the entity crowed, skipping in a circle around the standing obelisk. Watching a shadow skip was not the most bizarre thing he'd seen it do, but it was up there. None of them gave a shit about the Traximos, they were just using him. He assuredly regarded them as mere possessions. Nah. You'd see something very different if you took something from them that they actually, personally valued. In that case, you'd better hope the results were as mercifully swift as fire and claws out of the sky. The entity swirled around behind him, reaching to rest its intangible hands on his shoulders and lean forward in a posture to speak in his ear. Colin froze, grimacing. He hated it when it did this. Work that silver tongue of yours, Colin. I know, you being such a charmer is how you got yourself into trouble in the first place, but these aren't the daughters of dangerous aristocrats, and you're already neck-deep in them. Just about literally, I should think. Get those ladies of yours to like you, to really enjoy your company and care about your business. Then let slip how badly you were screwed over by the powers that be in Rivkabit. You probably wouldn't be able to stop Izaroa from personally rearranging their entire world to be a symphony of well-deserved torment. You might have to ask her nicely to slow down enough that you could watch. That was most certainly an idea, and one Colin couldn't even say he hadn't already thought of. The Lord Scribe, Hactria and her well-connected family. Even that one prison guard who was unnecessarily dickish to the inmates in clear disregard of the Empress's standards of conduct for civil servants. They had all been so above him, so impossibly powerful when last he dealt with any of them, strictly because of their relative places in the social and political hierarchy of the city. They were only variably powerful as individuals, only consistently powerful in contrast to, say, a scribe. Watching them all deal with the anger of the Golden Empress would be satisfying beyond belief. Poetic, and fulfilling in a way Colin could probably not achieve himself, even if he had the power to walk up and stab each in the heart and escape unscathed. Satisfying to him, at least. Why in all the hells did the entity care about this so much? The picture starting to form in Colin's mind was of all this as a means to an end. But the end was still baffling. His actions from now on would determine the shape of his forthcoming divinity, and the more emotionally powerful the more profound their effect. Very little would affect him as strongly as his longed-for retribution. But What did a god of schemes and plots gain from creating a god of revenge? Even that picture contained a few unverified assumptions, but it was the closest to a sensible pattern he'd been able to wrangle out of this. And according to Imam Al-Afine's expertise about gods, it was still in defiance of all sense and reason. Did the damn thing just want a friend? "I'll tell you what," he said, moving forward with a measured step and turning to place the entity back in his field of view. "I'm going to take your advice." "Attaboy." The entity silently applauded, holding up its shadowy hands so Colin could see the motion. "Since," he continued doggedly, "it's the only sensible thing for me to do anyway, and don't think I didn't notice you positioning yourself that way. Not exactly a miracle of positioning, buddy. I dunno if you've noticed, but I have learned not to assume you're gonna do the obvious and sensible thing. No shade, I promise, you've got ample reason to be suspicious." "That's real big of you to acknowledge," Colin retorted. "And on that note, I'm no longer a desperate refugee with nowhere else to turn. So, thank you in all sincerity for getting me this far. If you ever feel like actually telling me the straight truth about what you are and what you want, well, I'd be glad to listen. But if not, I think it's time for us to part ways." "Ah, Colin," the entity said softly. Softly, but, as usual, with an audible smile in its disembodied voice. "I have only ever wanted the best for you personally, and for the world that will be reshaped as you pass through it. As time goes on, I bet you'll figure out all the mysterious context that you've unwittingly moved through, or at least a portion of it. You'll probably come to thank me." "I just did." "Oh, why no." It waved one translucent hand airily. "I mean more authoritatively, from a standpoint of true understanding. But in any case, nah, you and me are all good. I've done my part. It's all up to you now. Don't you worry about a thing, Colin old pal, you've got it in hand from here. I believe in you." It drifted higher off the ground, went through a shiver in the air, then suddenly dissipated into wisps which drifted away to nothing. At Colin's feet, a new shadow suddenly spread across the timestone paving, as physics seemed to belatedly realize he was being lit by the sun. He drew in a long, slow breath, and let it out at the same pace. This was far from the first time he frankly disbelieved something the entity had told him. There was absolutely no way he'd just seen the last of that thing. And then, as if in deliberate contrast to the mood, his stomach loudly growled. Oh. Right. It was close to noon, and all he'd had was a nibble of dried meat and flatbread. That was all he was going to have, too. And, naturally, it was in the belt pouch he'd left on the bed back in Atraximos's, that was, in his lair. On the way back in, Colin spotted only Phenorexa, once again sprawled out in the library. This time she was reading a book, by having it hover in front of her face using some kind of telekinetic magic, since her enormous talons were entirely unsuited to handling it. Apparently the print wasn't too small for those eyes, though. He wondered why she didn't just use her smaller form, and decided not to bother asking. Colin politely greeted her, she ignored him, and he didn't push. It simply did not do to pester someone while they were reading. Also, one should never give a snarky adolescent an excuse to say something snide. They didn't need the encouragement. No one else was currently around in the central area, which was especially unfortunate as Colin could really have used a dragon as a teleportation reference point. Anything to make getting across the musty, acrid, bone-strewn mess shorter. It certainly wasn't doing his appetite any favors. Still, there was more to hunger than appetite, and he was actually starting to feel weak in the limbs by the time he reached the top of the stairs. Apparently he wasn't far enough along in the apotheosis process to be free of all mortal needs yet. The cool, clean hoard chamber was much more pleasant, though, just as he remembered it. Atraximos's wards obviously purified the air in addition to keeping the dust off. Colin beelined for the bed, finding his pouch right where he'd discarded it after his meager breakfast, and ripped it back open to dig in again. While he chewed, he considered again the dire situation of his food supply. Obviously, he was going to have to leave the lair and acquire more, and soon. Easier said than done, however. The only civilization from which he could buy anything was north, in the Evervals, and Colin did not know his way around there. He didn't even know the name of the nominal kingdom that was closest to here. The Vale kingdoms had a tendency to shift borders and change governments quite abruptly, at least compared to the constancy of Rivak. But he couldn't turn back south. Aside from the fact that he dropped dead of hunger and exposure long before making that trek across the savannah and desert, apparently the Nine were specifically opposed to his presence now. There was nothing else for it, he was going to have to get help from the dragons. Just as Colin began contemplating the best, or at any rate, the least terrible, way to approach this task, there came a timely commotion from outside. Still holding a handful of flatbread and jerky, he strode down the access corridor to see what the clattering and voices were all about, and immediately regretted this decision. Not coming to investigate, necessarily, but doing so with food in hand. The smell in here was not conducive to eating. In this case, the sight was worse. Everyone was emerging from their respective lairs, because Vadaralshi and Vanamax were dragging in the gigantic corpse of a mammoth. Based on the undisguised interest displayed by all three adults and Fenurix as they trotted closer, he gathered that meals must be communal, with the drakes taking it in turns to hunt. Surprising, based on the rest of their relationships, he'd have expected each young dragon to be responsible only for feeding themselves and their mother. Much as the dragon's social dynamics were of great importance to Colin's prospects, he was actually more immediately curious about how the two of them had carried the thing in flight. It was nearly as big as each of them. He could not imagine how they had worked mechanically. That was fast, Colin commented, causing the various dragons to look up at him. It's barely been. Well, can't have been more than a couple of hours since I saw you last. You bagged that thing already? Some of us are good at what we do, Mr. Pants, Vadaralshi said smugly, raising her chin. Colin ripped off another mouthful of jerky, and chewed, staring at her complacently. He carefully did not make eye contact with Vanamax, whom he could still see baring blooded teeth in displeasure at Colin's presence and lashing his tail. Bringing up what he'd last seen Vanamax in particular doing seemed likely to unnecessarily increase the tension in here. I assure you, Vadaralshi, Izaroa stated serenely, Colin is very good at what he does. However. Husband, just what are you eating? He swallowed, glanced down at his handful of rations, then looked back up at the 6 dragons now studying him curiously. Yes, well. About that. Chapter 17. Well, that's nothing, Vadaralshi said minutes later. Simple problem, simple solution. Colin had teleported over to join the group and explain his predicament, and also tucked away his meager lunch because no amount of hunger was going to get it down his throat at this point. The dragons had opted to begin their own lunch while they listened, and for all their conversational sophistication, in their more bestial forms they ate about as gracefully as monitor lizards. So in addition to the older bones and the general stink of rot, the immediate vicinity was now splattered with blood, hair, and various bits of mammoth. The smell was truly incredible. Now, Colin honestly couldn't tell whether Vadaralshi's grin was schadenfreude or genuine happiness at being helpful as she held out a dripping femur with most of its muscles still attached. The mammoth drumstick was nearly as long as he was tall. Here you go. The good news is you're tiny, so there's no real problem hunting for you, too. We probably wouldn't even need to bring in any more game. Colin stared at the grisly offering, then up at Vadaralshi. And then past her at his currently gigantic wives, who were unanimously watching this with undisguised amusement and fresh mammoth blood dripping from their faces. Fenurix cleared her throat. Humans can eat raw meat, in relatively small amounts, but it's harder for them to digest and they are vulnerable to parasites and similar microfauna. Most mortal races cook most of their food. Oh. Well, okay, sure. Vadaralshi pulled the hock of meat swiftly back up, incidentally scattering a spray of blood which Colin only dodged by teleporting, and held it up in front of her face. The blast of fire she produced lasted only 3 seconds, and then she proudly lowered the giant drumstick back down to Colin. At least it was no longer dripping. In fact, it was smoking, charred completely black, and noticeably smaller than it had been seconds ago. "Are you dense?" Phenorexa demanded. "I mean, medically. Is there just an extra layer of bone where your frontal cortex should be?" She hissed at her, scattering a spray of old bones with a lash of her tail. "Well rebutted as always, the blue dragon sneered, and then was buffeted to the floor as her mother swatted her upside the head with a wing. "No one's going to tell you not to needle your sister," Imaralafine scolded, "but doing so while she is trying to be helpful and you are merely being snide reflects poorly upon us both. Since you're so proud of how well-read you presume to be, daughter, tell us something useful about human dietary needs." "In fact, keeping a human adequately nourished is one of the few things we are not well equipped to do," Phenorexa stated, straightening back up. Like her siblings, she appeared to take being smacked around in stride, appearing neither cowed nor resentful. "Humans are omnivorous, and sufficiently versatile to subsist on a wide variety of available forage, but they cannot survive on the same diet as obligate carnivores such as ourselves. Optimally, a human should eat primarily leaf vegetables, bolstered by smaller amounts of fruit and animal proteins such as flesh and eggs. As available and necessary, their diet may be rounded out with grains, tree nuts, milk derivatives, and root vegetables." "Oh, really?" Aizaroa arched her neck highly, staring down her long nose at the younger dragon. "Your theoretical knowledge has some gaps, Phenorexa. Every human civilization, without exception, survives primarily upon grain." "Yes," Phenorexa agreed, and Colin took note of her extremely careful tone, sufficiently deferential to avoid provoking Aizaroa, but not so much as to irritate her own mother. "That is mostly for economic reasons, however. Grains are the most energy-dense and nutritious type of crop that can be easily cultivated in sufficient quantities to feed a large society, and stored for relatively long periods. But for an individual human, optimally. I've read accounts of many detailed experiments carried out by various rulers and wizards, many of which could not have been done in Rivak as they fell well short of your ethical standards, Aizaroa. Grain is a practical necessity for civilization, but given options, not the best cornerstone of a human diet. Its excessive consumption causes abnormal tooth decay, a host of digestive issues, and potentially neurological problems late in life. If we are going to feed Colin properly, he needs vegetables, fruit, and meat." She grinned at him. "Cooked meat. In small amounts." "This is cooked." She protested, wagging the chunk of charcoal on a bone which moments ago had been a mammoth leg. "What laughably delicate creatures," Vanamax snorted. "Well, he's supposedly a godling now, right? What's the worst that could happen if we don't feed him?" "I'll complain," Colin stated. Loudly and often. "You have not begun to resent me, Vanamax. I used to work in a government bureaucracy. I can teach you things about annoyance of which you haven't the imagination to conceive." In seriousness, Imaralafine added, "It is actually probable that he can't starve to death, but that is not an argument in favor of trying. On the contrary, a godling who is starved is likely to turn into a god of famine, which is high on the list of things I don't want in my front parlor. Or on my planet, for that matter." "We probably shouldn't feed him raw mammoth, then," Phenorexa mused, "or anything else that'll just make him sick, for the same reason. Could you even imagine a god of food poisoning?" "Even worse," Tiavathyres said quietly. "It seems his main aspect is already fixed, and we can only fine-tune it. Quite apart from the inherent value of preserving our husband's personal comfort, let us try not to elevate a god of starving or sickening dragons specifically." "Well then," Aizaroa said briskly, thumping her tail on the ground for emphasis, "we must clearly secure a long-term source of human food. This should not be delayed on any account, but as for the urgency. Husband, how much usable food do you still have? I can manage for another day or two, at a stretch, he said. And that's just with what I have. If you're willing to share your kills, and if I can build a much more modest fire and properly cook some, meat will definitely keep me from starving. For weeks, probably. I will need some veggies and fruit eventually, but it takes a while for nutritional deficiencies to really develop into a problem. It's not like I've been eating all that well for the last year, what with one thing and another. That, if anything, increases the urgency, husband, said Tiavatharis. Besides, it would be an unacceptable affront to our dignity for you to languish in anything less than the best conditions our collective power and wisdom can provide. Well. Imaralafine tossed her head proudly. That is certainly the case. As such, and because I have found you to be surprisingly pleasing company, husband, I deem it not a great imposition to donate a trinket or two from my own hoard to your well-being. Your generosity is exceedingly touching, Colin said cautiously. I'm curious, though, what in a dragon's hoard would be applicable? I hope you're not considering some kind of magical apparatus to pipe nutrition directly into him, Imaralafine, Iziroa snorted. Those never work without adverse side effects in the best cases, and there's no telling how such a thing would affect a godling. Obviously, Imaralafine retorted scathingly. No, the essential problem remains. We must secure a source of food for Colin. However, I can contribute something to tide him over until that is done, something rather more suitable for the head of a draconic family than those bits of sticks and pocket lint he's eating. That's jerky and hardtack, Tiavatharis corrected. A serviceable soldier's ration. Whatever. It's nowhere near as sufficient as this. She gestured casually with one claw, and with a swirl of light something manifested in the air in front of Colin, at roughly a dragon's eye level. It floated slowly downward, lit by its own spotlight which Imaralafine appeared to have conjured as well. The thing came to a halt at about his waist level and hovered there, slowly rotating in the air and glistening under its personal illumination. He stared, dumbstruck, at the cake. It was a cake, that much he could tell, but only after a moment's scrutiny. It was easily the most elaborate, artful confection Colin had ever seen. Rising in a total of 6 tapering tiers, the highest towering over his head at its current altitude, it was deliberately crafted with a kind of lopsided symmetry, each tier angled in a different fanciful shape which, taken together, created a sense of harmonious balance. Layers of sugar icing in different shades, fading from white at its peak to deep blue on the largest bottom tier, were further accented with elaborate shapes and spun sugar representing a different theme on each tier. A spray of waves on the base, pillars and battlements on the next, then sculpted trees, flowers and vines, a collection of abstract swirling shapes that he took to be representative of blowing wind, and finally glittering stars on the uppermost tier. Sitting at the very peak of the cake was a huge crescent moon made of spun sugar, carved in facets and polished until it glittered like a jewel. Colin stared at the cake, then up at Imaralafine, who beamed proudly down at him. Her muzzle was still covered in blood. Imaralafine, why? Iziroa demanded in exasperation. HMPH. Imaralafine lifted her nose, swishing her tail through the bones behind her for emphasis. And here I thought you of all dragons might appreciate culture. I have seldom found reason to walk among mortal civilizations, and it has been many years since the last such event, but in my youth I did study magic in the halls of Evansidle. Humans by and large fail to interest me, but I do have fond memories of the city and the mastery of magic which permeated even its humblest works. This is one of several pieces I commissioned from its most prestigious bakery. I never much cared for pastry, in fact, but they catered to kings and emperors. Actual battles were fought to command the interest of that house's chefs. Long have I held these artworks and magical preservation among my hoard, but surely no such trinket is more important than my husband's well-being. Iziroa twisted her whole neck around to bury her head under her wing. After a moment she began shaking. Imaralafine scowled suspiciously at her. Truly a noble sentiment, Imaralafine, Tiavathyres said gravely. It reflects most admirably upon you. Colin was still staring at the cake. Evincidal had been a famous kingdom of magic, destroyed in a tsunami sent by a rival such nation as part of the ancient Transcendence Wars. The conflict had wiped out most of the magically advanced societies which existed at that time, ushering in a 500-year darkness. It had ended more than 3 millennia ago. He was looking at a perfectly preserved pastry older than the progenitor civilizations of any currently extant nation. I am absolutely astonished at such generosity, Colin said, struggling for poise. Truly, I have no words, Imaralafine. But, for exactly that reason, I'm afraid I cannot accept this. What? She scowled down at him. Why not? Because he appreciates history, I should think, said Phanorexa. And couldn't bear the thought of one of your treasures going to waste, which is what would immediately happen, Mother. Confections are not good for humans. They are to be enjoyed in moderation at most and better yet, sparingly. Colin can't live on cake, it would make him even sicker than trying to live on raw mammoth. And it's only speaking generally, Tiavathyres added. If his body is accustomed to plain food such as those travel rations, he probably couldn't even eat a few bites of that without immediately heaving it up again. I simply could not bear to be responsible for such a travesty, Colin agreed. Well, I suppose I must accept that, then, Imaralafine said grudgingly. I certainly would not want it to end up like that after being so carefully preserved for so long. She gestured again, and with another swirl of light, the cake vanished back to wherever it lived in her hoard. Colin felt an odd sense of relief that it was safe again. What a truly precious little greenhouse orchid he is, Venomax sneered. Well, if you insist it's important to feed him, that leaves the question of how. Since apparently nothing available to us suitable for his tremulous mortal constitution. Shut up, Venomax, Izyroa ordered. No one has forgotten your recent performance. On this of all days, be useful or be silent. As for Colin, we will simply have to arrange for regular deliveries of suitable food. As simple as that? Tiavathyres countered. I do not understate the importance of this, but we must balance it with the preservation of our privacy, for Colin's sake as well as our own. Any involvement with mortals presents risks. Yes, Izyroa agreed, dipping her head. We must do our best to manage them, but the risk has to be taken. She coughed and spat out a mouthful of charcoal and ash. She had apparently gotten bored and tried to eat the charred mammoth leg. Blarg. Why in all the hells would you want to do this to food? How does that make it easier for sensitive stomachs to digest? You didn't cook it, imbecile, you just destroyed it, said Phanorexa. Yeah, you wanna be next? She flared her wings aggressively, but her sister just rolled her eyes and turned her head away. Anyway, the food supply thing doesn't seem like such a big problem. Or are you three really gonna pretend you don't all have contact with mortal merchants? All three elder dragons hissed at her. She immediately flattened herself submissively to the ground. Dragons like treasure too much not to collect it, Phanorexa explained to Colin, lowering her head to his level and grinning. But Atraximos made a big production about having sole looting rights in our territory. The three of us were allowed to bring back food, not valuables. Our respective mothers had too. Imaralafine whacked her with her tail, banging her head into the floor. Phanorexa immediately shut up, but winked at Colin. Yes, well, Izyroa said with deep dignity. Be all that as it may, we are not without avenues to explore. We must simply determine the specifics. He had really expected that to degenerate into more squabbling, but somewhat to his surprise, his three wives came to a swift agreement on what needed to be done. The first step required someone to escort him to the nearest bastion of mortal civilization and secure a food supply, which brought up the only real sticking point, which of them would get the honor. Fortunately, even that yielded quickly to reason. Of the three, obviously Merhalafine was the best at magic, including that which would enable a dragon to pass for a mortal, but Isaroa not only had the most practice at that specific trick, but was unquestionably the best at interacting with mortal society. And so, minutes later, Colin was back in his room, still feeling out of place in the enormous chamber laid out as a museum of Atraximos's depredations, preparing for his next journey. He had finished his lunch while leveraging the wards to sort through the hoard for things he would need. After Merhalafine's display, he had checked, just out of curiosity, and nope, Atraximos the Dread had not preserved any foodstuffs among his treasures. He hid several bottles of wine, and to Colin's surprise a variety of enchanted cooking implements, but nothing edible. There was a lot that would be specifically useful to him, though, both in general and for this excursion. First of all, Colin had selected the best bag of holding, of which Atraximos had a very large collection because adventurers tended to carry them and he had killed a lot of those. The old dragon was something of a neat freak and a meticulous note-taker. Presumably he'd done that for his own satisfaction, but the habit now proved extremely helpful to Colin in identifying the source and nature of his new possessions. There were handy placards on everything, detailing each item's history and functions. First off, it aided him in identifying which of the absolutely vast amounts of coinage lying in these vaults he should bring. The bag of holding was able to carry a truly ridiculous amount of money. Colin opted to restrain himself for the sake of not provoking questions he didn't want to answer by selecting coins of local and recent mint. Hopefully any city big enough to have money changers, banks, or merchant guilds wouldn't be that surprised by foreign currency, but a commotion might ensue if he tried to hand out Laerold coins or anything similarly ancient. That was also how he learned the name of the kingdom which claimed the valley spread out below the dragon's lair, Boisverd. He'd heard of it, back in Rivkabad, though only in passing. Rivak only had commerce and diplomacy with the coastal kingdoms of the Avervals, because while Boisverd and probably several other little countries were much closer to the empire, they were closer across a stretch of flatland which tended to come under frequent dragon attack. There were no roads or trade routes connecting them. Just one of the things that would dramatically change once people begin to realize the dread dragon had fallen. The next step was to attire and equip himself. While Atraximos's tastes ran to the expensive, gaudy, and heavily magical, he had also accumulated everything the innumerable would-be dragon slayers had dropped as a point of principle, and so Colin had an enormous selection of camping and survival equipment from which to choose. He wasn't planning to need anything like that on this trip, but armed himself with a generous array of it anyway. His long months on the road had taught him to appreciate such a bounty, and carrying a pouch at his waist that could contain a house or two, there was no need to skimp. It was annoying that Atraximos had bothered to not only save but categorize all this, but had thrown out the various unfortunate adventurers' rations when his magic could easily have preserved them. Then again, it did seem pretty on brand for the dread. For clothing, Colin dressed in the height of imperial fashion, or what had been a couple of years ago. The locals wouldn't know the difference, and he'd probably stick out more by trying to approximate their own fashions, about which he knew nothing. Atraximos had evidently taken out quite a few Riva of high standing, to judge by the expensive and often magical garments and Rivkabad style Colin found in his collection. Probably adventurers who'd gone after him first, to judge by the enchantments upon them. For now, Colin selected a serviceable outfit and packed away enough changes for a week, which was longer than they were planning to spend. He tried not to think about what had indicated that none of these clothes were torn or blood-stained. With that, preparations for the trip were complete, and there was nothing left but to meet Isaroa out front and depart. However, his brief experience of dragon lunch had been the straw that broke the camel's back. Colin was determined to do something about the condition of this place before he did anything else. There had to be something in here which could help. Atraximos's ward network was amazingly user-friendly. With no more effort than a thought, Colin could view and browse through the entire hoard, sorting its contents according to seemingly any criteria he could devise. That proved immediately relevant as he didn't particularly know what he was looking for, only what he wanted to do. There were a surprising number of enchanted brooms, mops, and dusters tucked away, including some that would function independently and automatically, but none were equal to the task at hand. What was needed out there was as much excavation as cleaning, and that on a scale that even the magical shovel and wheelbarrow Colin found wouldn't be able to accomplish. In addition to strength and carrying capacity, this was a task for something with at least some ability to interpret orders and make decisions. He found a few magical automata, but nothing that seemed large enough, clever enough, or generally suitable. After a few minutes of frustration, Colin somewhat reluctantly turned his attention to the far more valuable portions of the hoard. Atraximos had certain treasures of truly astonishing rarity and power, the kinds of things that seemed a waste to put to such a prosaic use as he now had in mind. But then again, they were his, by right of conquest. Everyone had been very clear on that point. And Colin was not a dragon. He found value in things that were useful, not just sitting around being, well, hoarded. At the tug of his will, the item upon which he had focused his attention was ported instantly out of its vault and dropped into his hand, a black scroll longer than his forearm. For a moment he just held it, thinking about the description on its attached note card in the spot where it had been resting for the last 4 centuries. What he was about to do seemed grandiose, preposterously self-indulgent, and possibly a little sacrilegious. Maybe he should reconsider this plan. Then Colin thought about the sea of bones outside, and the smell. He broke the seal and unfurled the scroll. Chapter 18. This is the central area, as I described. You see what I mean. Colin came to a stop at the top of the stairs, gesturing across the huge expanse of the lair's main chamber and looking aside at his companion. The spectral soldier came to parade rest and nodded once. They were unnerving to look at, all of them. The ghosts were translucent bones and a sickly blue in color. It was odd to see those intangible skeletons through their equally intangible armor. If they were just armored skeletons, that would be sufficiently spooky, but each soldier seemed to shift and shimmer when looked at, sometimes showing meat on those bones in varying states of mummification or decay. Occasionally, such as now, when he studied the commander sidelong, Colin would catch a fleeting glimpse of what might have been a living or at least fully preserved face. Mostly, though, they wouldn't have been taken for living people even were they not translucent and faintly glowing. The corridor directly across from here leads to the front exit. That will be your primary means of ingress and egress. Of the 4 large side corridors accessible from the lower floor there, those 3 are off limits. He pointed to each of the doorways in question. They are the personal quarters of my consorts, whose privacy is sacrosanct. You may enter solely if you urgently require the attention of the lady of the apartment in question, and even in such a rare event, touch nothing. The commander saluted, a gesture which involved stomping his left foot and placing his left forearm horizontally across his chest. Colin had never seen the like, but then he knew nothing of the culture from which they had come save that it was centuries extinct. "Husband, what is this?" Isaroa demanded in alarm. She was waiting for him across the room near the front entrance, and now straightened up to her full majestic height, staring at Colin and the ranks of phantasmal soldiers which he had poured out of the hoard chamber behind him, sorting themselves swiftly into formation across the raised platform. While Colin had been speaking, the other dragons had begun emerging from their respective lairs in curiosity, and now he had the presence and attention of all 6. All of them were noticeably perturbed, and Colin didn't bother denying to himself that it was rather satisfying to see. "A moment, please, my lady wife," he said courteously, bowing to Isaroa. "I apologize for the delay. You shall have my full attention anon now, Commander. That last archway over there leads to the library, and the passage beyond to the ruined city. You may pass through the library, as necessary, but do not touch anything therein or interfere with anyone reading or sleeping there. Everything else accessible via the smaller passages should be maintained as I directed. Don't interfere with any of the dragons. comply with any orders from Iziroa, Imaralafine, or Tiavatharis which do not countermand my own." He paused, watching the shifting face of the undead commander, which remained inscrutable. Actually it couldn't make expressions at all, most of the time. The skeletal form appeared to be the default, with only occasional flickers of mostly rotted flesh and an actual face so rarely and briefly he could barely get a sense of it. Colin had already ascertained that the phantom soldiers could not speak, but he seemed to have the ghost's attention, so he continued. "I want you to establish security patrols around this mountain. Sweep the Timekeeper City for any threats and dispatch them, but for the rest of the perimeter. At the moment, prioritize discretion above all else. Watch for intruders and bring me warning if we are approached, but if at all possible do not let yourselves be discovered. Our objective is to conceal my presence and the demise of Atraximos the Dread as long as possible. Inevitably the world will learn of it, and then we will move to a more defensive posture, but until then, discretion above all else. Report to me if any intrusion is detected. In my absence, report to and seek orders from my consorts. Tiavatharis will take charge of any military matters, Imaralafine of magical threats, and Iziroa in the event that diplomacy is called for." He made sure to point to each of them so the ghosts would know who was who. The commander saluted again. The dragon stared, aghast. "In addition to defense, you will be in charge of facilities maintenance. I want this. All of this. Cleaned up. You will need to scout for a suitable disposal area for this accumulation of bones. Do not use the city for that, both because it would be an archaeological travesty and because hauling this detritus through the library will not be acceptable. Once you've secured an appropriate dumping ground, just clean it." "Husband." Tiavatharis stepped carefully forward, her tone incredulous as she stared at the ranks of undead soldiers behind Colin. "You have unsealed the scroll of the Phantom Legion. And you are making them clean?" Colin kept in mind his social needs here and did not say any of the first several things he wanted to. Instead, he just smiled, courteous and bland as he ever had at unreasonable ministers in the royal archives. "Of course, my lady wife, I would not dream of stepping upon your prerogatives. Obviously, this has been your home far longer than mine. If any of you feel at a point of pride or principle to clean the place yourselves, you may have the first opportunity." All the dragons except Fenorexa and Iziroa reared up in almost comical affront at the idea. "Ahem." Fenorexa grinned sardonically. "The human obsession with cleanliness is a bestial adaptation to your species' mortal frailty. Our constitutions are not so vulnerable to germs and the like." The others all nodded in unison, expressions proud. Dragons. They were so majestic, awe-inspiring, insufferably smug and oddly juvenile. It was almost like being back in the archives and dealing with recalcitrant co-workers, except that now he had power, which he needed to carefully not throw around lest he burn bridges he would urgently need to cross in the future. Restraint, understanding, and charm. "I have only seen 3 of the 5 personal chambers in this complex," he said with a pleasant smile, "but I do know the consistent pattern that all are spotless, even fastidious." "They are just as you say, husband," Imaralafine sniffed. "Personal chambers. Their condition reflects upon us." "Ah," he replied, nodding and putting on an understanding expression. "I am of course still acquainting myself with the nuances of draconic etiquette. Perhaps you would be so indulgent as to explain, then, why it is not an affront to all our dignity that our home smells like a dockworker's loincloth boiled in onion soup." At that, they all stared, several with their mouths slightly open. After a second, Fenorexa huffed out a soft laugh. "Ah, I just love how witty he is." Venomox turned an incredulous sneer upon her, which she ignored. "This is an army of undead soldiers," Tiavatharis continued as if never interrupted, staring at him. "Cleaning. Arkansas Colin, for centuries that scroll has lain untouched, passing through the hands of multiple owners who knew not to tamper with such power, and the responsibility it represents. This is a tool that could be used to conquer kingdoms, to form an empire. But I don't want to conquer kingdoms and form an empire, Colin said mildly. I want this place cleaned up. And I don't see anyone else doing it. She's entire muzzle deformed as she bit down on her lips and ducked her head, shifting subtly out of her mother's field of view. Husband, I fear you don't. Tiavatharis's voice carried rising frustration. She paused mid-sentence to compose herself before continuing. These were the last surviving legion of the Amagdarish hegemony, cursed to imprisonment in that scroll for abandoning their oath of duty to their homeland in order to save themselves. Their penance is a lifetime of unquestioning service to whosoever breaks the seal, to be released only by that person's death. But Arkansas Colin, you are a godling. If we do not fail in protecting you, you will live. Potentially forever. You may have just condemned the souls of this legion to an eternity of servitude. Well, those details had definitely not been in Atraximos's meticulous note cards. Had he not known, or just not considered it worth noting? Colin looked sidelong at the commander of the Phantom Legion, who was still standing there at attention. A grinning skull was impassive even if illusory flesh flickered across it now and again. However, I see, he said aloud. That's unfortunate. Or maybe not. For a legion of oathbreakers, that's likely to be a kinder eternity than whatever they were headed for next. There's also the fact that this apotheosis business seems to involve the development of my own extra-dimensional domain, yes? And many gods use theirs as an afterlife for the souls of their faithful. Depending on how things go, I may be able to offer them that eternal reprieve, after all. Colin turned to directly face the commander, who still stood at attention, inscrutable. I'm not going to promise any specific outcome, since it remains to be seen how things will develop, and I won't give my word if I might not be able to keep it. I do promise, however, that I'll reward faithful and diligent service as well as I am able. The commander saluted again. Behind him, so did the entire legion. Well, this was turning out to be more complicated than Colin had thought when he'd gone looking for an artifact to help clean the lair. He had rummaged around for a broom and now was responsible for the eternal fates of however many souls. He hadn't exactly taken a head count. On the one hand, that responsibility verged on the overwhelming, but on the other, they were apparently in this situation because they had betrayed and abandoned their oaths of service. Colin was no soldier, but he had been raised as a public servant of his empress and empire, and above all, of the people whose labor and taxes supported him. People who counted on him and his fellow agents of the state to keep their nation running and their lives peaceful. To abandon that charge when the need was most dire. Such treason was contemptible almost beyond words. They were already being punished, so he wouldn't pile any deliberate misery onto them, but it was very hard for him to be sympathetic. Isairoa and I will be departing on an errand and will be gone for several days. Until my return, carry out my orders as best you are able. Dismissed. The commander and his troops saluted once more, the single mass stump of their spectral boots filling the chamber, and then they flowed into motion. After that first salute, their movement was silent as the ghosts drifted over the ground with their feet off it rather than walking. Perhaps for the same reason, it was fast. The commander silently pointed in several directions in sequence, and the legion separated into squads and proceeded about their objectives, vanishing into each of the smaller side corridors, with the largest detachments moving into the paths through the library and out the front door. Phanorexis scrabbled hastily out of the way, stumbling into a drift of bones in her alarm. Isairoa sidestepped with far more dignity, watching the ghosts flowing past her with a concerned frown. "You cannot be serious," Venomix exclaimed. "You mean to have these undead just underfoot in our home?" "That is correct," Colin said calmly. "If you have any objection to the way I do things, Venomax, I invite you to raise them with me in a polite manner and at a reasonable volume for indoor conversation, or failing that, to shut up." The dragon bristled, arching his neck and wings aggressively and baring teeth. Colin stared at him across the expanse of the lair, expressionless. After 2 long seconds, Venomex snorted loudly, then turned and stalked back into Iziro's private chamber. Tiavatharis cleared her throat. That aside, husband, I see that you have equipped yourself. Did you mislead me during our earlier conversation, or are you in fact completely untrained in the use of weapons? Ah, yes. Colin dropped one hand to his belt, patting the hilt of the Koppish sword hanging there. I certainly did not mislead you, my lady wife. I have no martial training whatsoever. And yes, I believe I see where this is going. I do indeed understand the foolishness of carrying weapons one does not know how to use. I selected this one out of the horde because it is a Riva-style sword which will not look incongruous with these clothes, and its enchantment enables an unskilled wielder to use it like a swordsman. The green dragon snorted, actually emitting a puff of smoke. I am familiar with such enchantments. I wonder, husband, if you were able to intuit my opinion of them. That they are a crutch and a shortcut unworthy of a true warrior, whose use will only handicap the development of actual skill. He smiled at her and patted the sword again. I don't disagree, Tiavatharis. In the years to come, I hope to benefit from your guidance and have no need of crutches. However, here and now, I must hobble before I can run. Not that I expect to be in danger, given that I will be in Iziro's company, but it's always the unexpected that gets you. It seems awfully foolish to own a massive arsenal of enchanted weapons and then walk around helpless and vulnerable. Very well, husband. To his surprise, she appeared to find this answer satisfactory, even bowing her head to him. Carelessness I will not abide, but I do not expect to agree with all of your decisions. That you have given the matter serious thought and committed to a sensible plan is all I ask. I wish you good fortune on your errand, Arkansas Colin, and I shall eagerly await your return. Even in her greater reptilian form, there was no mistaking the smoky look she gave him, nor the warm undercurrent in her tone. Colin kept his smile in place and just nodded to her, not trusting his voice to work without leaking frustration. What was with this hot and cold routine? What the hells did she want from him? Instead of dealing with her any further, he teleported all the way across the chamber, arriving next to Iziro's feet. Colin bowed to her even as she swiveled her neck to look down at him. My thanks for your patience, lady wife, and utmost apologies for the discourtesy of keeping you waiting. Perhaps the city to which we are going will afford me an opportunity to make it up to you. You owe me no apology, husband, she demurred, inclining her own head deeply in acknowledgement. You shall never hear me complain that you prioritize your responsibilities to this household and family. But should you find reason in town to indulge me, I will certainly not say no. Now, hop on and let's be off. He hadn't done this exactly, but it was a simple extrapolation from tricks he already knew. Colin focused, and shifted instantly through space, arriving perched astride Iziro's neck just before her shoulders, between two of her back spines. You're going to let him ride you? Vadaril, she sounded utterly scandalized. He already has, Iziro stated, twisting her neck to give Colin a sidelong smile. Exceedingly well, I might add. Tiavatharis heaved a sigh. Iziro, innuendo is the reverse of most art forms. The oldest and best-known examples are the least esteemed, not the most. Iziro's pointed face radiated smugness as she lifted her head and turned back to the tunnel entrance. Speak for yourself. I am a classicist. So declaring, she stepped forward. Keeping astride her was a bit more difficult than Colin had anticipated. Though her gait was smooth, her sheer size meant that even her smallest movements had a lot of back and forth that threatened to dislodge him if he didn't hold on tightly. This was harder than riding a camel, and much harder than riding a horse. He had never had the opportunity to sit astride an elephant, but he suspected it would be something like that. They emerged onto the plaza outside the lair, and Iziro flared her wings, stretching them to their fullest extent. Let us take the opportunity to experiment, husband, she suggested. You seem able to control the position of a dragon in physical space. Can you affix yourself to my back while in flight? That is an interesting idea. Colin frowned in thought, concentrating. When he focused on her, he could feel her entire being, not just the smooth scales under his legs. The enormous wellspring of power astride which he was perched resonated deeply with the divine glow inside himself. Colin could sense them mingling, entwining. He had to nudge it away from a true merging. There was absolutely no telling what that would do. But now that he was concentrating upon it, yes, it was a question of thinking in relative terms. Not of moving her through space, but keeping his power affixed in space to hers. Yes. Yes, I believe I can. Let's try it, anyway. It's safe enough to experiment, since we know I can teleport to you. If I fall off, I bet I can get right back on before you even have time to rescue me. That is well, husband. I am willing to indulge you to a very great degree, but not for you or anyone will I be put into bridle and saddle. Yes, I know, he said solemnly, reaching forward to stroke his hand along the black, golden-edged scales before him. Third date. Izaroa laughed, beat her wings once, and sent them shooting aloft. It should have been terrifying. It should have been dizzying and disorienting. Creatures such as he were simply not meant to soar through the sky. All Colin could feel was elation unlike anything he had ever experienced. Several pumps of her wings brought them above the peak of the mountain, and then above the highest peak in view. She deliberately shot through a cloud, which was extremely cold and left him soaked, and then glided smoothly across the top of it, disturbing white eddies of vapor. They burst out past its leading edge, and the entire scope of the world was laid out before him. Being now drenched and high in the atmosphere, Colin should definitely have been miserable to the point of endangering his health. Part of his resilience was undoubtedly godling business, but mostly, he was reveling in the sheer joy. He spread his arms wide, keeping astride her with only the joining of their power, and let out a whoop of pure exultation. Izaroa answered him with a roar. The black dragon and her rider banked and plunged downward. Colin's stomach shot upward into his throat, a sensation such as he'd ever experienced and already couldn't wait to do so again. She leveled out just above the crowns of the pine forest which spread through the valley, then beat her wings to gain altitude as they sailed toward another mountainside. Izaroa steepened her ascent, keeping close to the nearly vertical surface of rock, and actually scampered up its highest peak with her claws, using it as a springboard to shoot skyward again. In the last 30 seconds they had traversed more distance than he could have managed on foot in a day, and that was with a lot of entirely gratuitous swooping about just for the joy of it. Also, do people live in that valley? He raised his voice to be heard above the roar of air. It didn't seem to work, as he could barely make out his own words, but she clearly heard him just fine. Her own voice certainly had no trouble projecting. Some few. Its proximity to our home makes it one of the most unpopular residences in the Evervilles, save the Criplins and Spider's Gorge. Mostly bandits and the like, the sort of people whose presence is not tolerated in more civilized places. Hence my unconcern with occasionally terrifying them. Fair enough. But you touch upon an important point, Colin. They were soaring across an unbroken chain of mountain peaks, but up ahead he thought he could see them dropping away into another, perhaps larger valley. Our plan is to approach civilization, and it will not do to have them alarmed by the arrival of a dragon. I'd rather no one there even suspect one might be in the vicinity. Let us test your limits again. I am going to perform a spell. See if you can discern its nature and perhaps reproduce it. By all means. And he could feel it. The magic was like another heartbeat, like a thrum of static through his senses. By concentrating on her he could feel her focusing almost as clearly as if it was his own working. The spell unfolded and took effect, and Izaroa vanished from view, leaving him seemingly shooting through the sky by himself, straddling the breeze. He could sense the spell, feel its nature and purpose intuitively. He knew exactly what it did and how he could seize control of it from her. What he did not know was how to construct such a thing from scratch. What a heady, even disturbing feeling, to be able to so effortlessly command powers he didn't even understand, powers of which she had attained mastery as one should, through effort and skill. Calm did not take it away from her, but after a moment of concentration, found just the right angle at which to pull. The magic swell to cover him as well, sunk in to wrap around him like a blanket. He also vanished from sight. Somehow that was more eerie than seeing her vanish out from under him, perhaps because his instinctive sense of her told him everything about her presence and position even more clearly than his awareness of his own now invisible body. And thus, he could tell when she swiveled her head around to look at him mid-flight, or at least the place where he was. "Excellent!" she exclaimed. "Your persistent refusal to disappoint is one of your finer points, husband. Well, I'm relieved to be able to show it off. I'm just storing up favor against the day you find out what my cooking is like." Isaiah laughed again, and banked, changing their course so that, now invisible, they crested another ridge and were over a great vale with a city in the distance. Their next adventure. Tobe continued.